Welcome to the SecurityDNA podcast, powered by SecurityInfoWatch. This is your frontline for bold insights and real intelligence that cuts through the noise and gets straight to what matters most. I'm Samantha Shover, Assistant Editor of SecurityInfoWatch and producer of today's episode. At SecurityInfoWatch, we deliver sharp, real-time insights into the biggest challenges facing security and risk professionals today. From emerging threats to game-changing technologies, we go beyond the headlines to provide expert analysis, real-time trends, and critical risk intelligence, giving you the knowledge you need to stay ahead in this rapidly evolving landscape. Rodney Bosch, SIW's Editor-in-Chief, will be joining us as host today in a sit-down with Echodyne's VP of Marketing, Leo McCloskey. Leo leads Echodyne's brand and marketing efforts and was the company's representative on the Federal Aviation Administration's Advanced Rulemaking Committee for BVLOS and Detection and Mitigation. Prior to Echodyne, Leo built and led marketing and product marketing teams in the US and Europe for several companies, from small startups to established brands. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rodney.
Sam, thanks very much. Leo, great to have you on today.
Thanks for having me on, Rodney.
We're going to dive into one of the fastest growing threats in critical infrastructure, and that's small drones. With unauthorized drone activity increasingly common from power stations to stadiums, the need for reliable detection and defense strategies has never been more urgent. Echodyne is a U.S.-based company that designs and manufactures advanced radar systems and plays a leading role in counter-drone security. Leo and I are going to discuss the emerging aerial threat landscape, the technologies being deployed to address it, and how organizations can harden their defenses. Leo, let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to kind of start around the urgency and landscape kind of theme. Two recent executive orders expand federal counter-UAS authority and boost domestic drone production to reduce foreign reliance. From your vantage point at Echodyne, how did these actions shift urgency and direction of protecting critical infrastructure from aerial threats?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Rodney. And the executive orders have been a welcome move forward, there's no doubt. The authorities that we're looking to have extended down to state, local, territorial, and tribal police, who would be the partners for critical infrastructure and sort of drone security, securing the airspace. Those authorities have yet to be extended in the way that would sort of give everyone comfort. So I would suggest that these executive orders, especially on the BVLOS side, in terms of putting more things in the air, have been really instrumental in terms of moving the airspace industry forward. I think the concurrent step that we're sort of only a half step on is how do we best secure the airspace relative to the more things we're putting up in it.
Okay, what types of critical infrastructure are most at risk today, and what kinds of drone-based incidents are raising alarms among public and private security stakeholders?
Yeah, so we sort of look to how CISA considers critical infrastructure in the United States. And so they break it up into 16 different verticals, which you can find on their website. You know, pretty much anything that is a utility that helps the American society move forward, helps the American society run on a daily basis. Sort of all of those things are at risk. And then, of course, there are a number of industries that create things that use chemicals and other materials that can combust. And so those all need to be secured as well. And then, of course, there are other facilities that would be near waterways and other things that we need to protect in order for a way of life as well. And so there's a great deal that goes into the idea of securing the infrastructure. I think, there's maybe a mindset in the security space that sort of, we were doing pretty good on the ground plane and felt we had that secured. And so we're adding the air, 1 + 1 = 2. And so it's sort of a level 2 problem. But really, when you add the airspace, it's not a linear change, it's an exponential change. And so the complications and the complexities of securing the airspace, doing it properly and in a way that doesn't interfere with air traffic, that's a tricky bargain that we all have to, put our efforts behind. And it's going to take us a while to get there. And so it's, as much as we like to see some progress from what we have seen in terms of advancements for securing critical infrastructure, we should not be complacent. We have a long way to go.
Yeah. So we've been seeing headlines about drone sightings. I know late last year there was an attempted attack on a power station in Nashville, not to mention, unauthorized flyovers at NFL games and such. What do these examples reveal about the current state of these aerial threats?
Well, I think the first thing it reveals is just how easy it is. If you think about, there's over 1 million drones in the United States, and within a couple of years, it'll be well over 3. And those are a lot of aircraft that can be repurposed into something we wouldn't rather them be. But I think it's important when we think about the threat, we sort of break it up, and we like to think of sort of a Bell diagram of sorts. And so sort of on one end, you've got a risk, and that risk is what we call, or many call, the sort of careless and clueless. Somebody who gets a drone is flying in a way that is unsafe or outside the norms, whether it's thrill seeking or whatever, but not intentionally causing harm, but it certainly can cause harm because they're not following the rules. That is a certain risk that we have to handle. And I would say that's the majority of the risk today. On the other side, though, of that curve is your true existential risk, terrorist threat of using drones either individually or in coordinated fashion in a way that causes real damage to the United States. And when you think about those two threats, you have to focus more or less on that 1%, the lowest risk, but the highest risk of harm, and secure against that, because that gets you everything else. And so it requires a great deal of systems development, a lot of testing. It's going to require a mindset in the industry to sort of change around what does airspace security mean? What you really need to have is good airspace security. So I think it's a journey that we're going to be on as an industry, but it's a journey we're going to be on together, and we're going to have to move pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah. So, as I understand it, part of the challenge is cost. Drones are cheap, they're widely available, they're easy to modify. How does this affordability impact the way security pros think about defending critical infrastructure against aerial threats?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there's real differences in the challenge, as well as a common thread between sort of what goes on in the defense space, what goes on in the civilian space. And in the defense space, there's a real focus on what some people call engagement economics, which is the cost of defense versus the cost of attack. To your point about drones being very cost efficient, I mean, they're almost incredibly cheap, actually. A couple $100, you can make one in your garage, and it's an incredibly well-equipped aircraft, actually. And because you have that cost, you don't really want to have that cost of defense to be exorbitant, because then you would have your economics are upside down. The symmetry is gone. And so we want to have some symmetry between the cost of attack and the cost to defend. And so what we're after here is, how do we find the right sort of equipment that can go in the civilian space and do the job that's similar in defense? Now, on the defense side, when you want to remove the threat, you have lots of options in front of you in terms of kinetic weapons in order to eliminate that threat. On the civilian side, you have far fewer options. And I've seen it argued quite persuasively, actually, that things like accuracy actually matter more on the civilian side than they do on the defense side, because you don't have the risk of being able to miss and having other collateral damages you might have in a battlefield. In the civilian space, you need to know exactly where that object is, and you need to be able to get after it in a pinpoint fashion. And so it actually makes the civilian job a bit harder. And so if you start thinking about the engagement economics again, we have to do this in a way that's very cost efficient. We have to do this in a way that is sensible, where we don't have everyone rushing to the doors and throwing money around, trying to cover a threat that we can take more time to get after in a more sensible fashion.
Right. So when it comes to counter-drone technology, radar often plays a central role. What makes radar essential to detecting and tracking these smaller drones, even in complex environments?
Yeah, and that's exactly it, is that radar will be able to track any and all movement, regardless of the scene, the environment, the weather, lighting. Any of those things just don't matter from a radar perspective. And that really is the beauty of radar. It detects and tracks any and all movement in the airspace. Even if you have the right sort of radar that has micro Doppler capabilities, you can detect the spin of the propeller from a hovering drone. And the drone itself is a movement. You're seeing movement from the propellers, and a good radar should be able to pick that up and identify and be able to track that object even when it's in a hovering state. And so radar becomes that primary sensor that when it detects, it then powers the rest of the security system, the counter-UAS system. So the next sensor you might want to turn to then is an optical sensor, which then puts eyes on the object for positive identification. And so the way that works is the radar data sort of slews the optical and then points the optical wherever that drone is going. And so you need a good radar that's going to be able to lock that optical sensor onto the object. And then if you're going to do anything on the mitigation side that requires any sort of accuracy and directionality, then you need radar as well to tell you exactly where it is. And so the data across the entire security process, observe, orient, direct, and act, those are things where radar plays a role in every step of that process.
So for our audience, many of whom are integrators, Leo, can you explain how Echodyne goes to market? Like, do you work directly with integrators, or do you primarily, support deployments through tech partners and larger security implementations?
Well, the answer is largely yes. We sort of have a unique path to market because we have intellectual property and how we make the radar that makes us very unique in the market. I mean, just at a fundamental hardware level, we have some differentiation that at the end of the day just creates a better radar. It's going to be more accurate than really everything else that's out there. And so, we start with that differentiation at the radar level, sort of make us unique in the market. And then the question is, how do we make sure that people know that? So we want to work with the end users. So they know what the art of the possible is, what, a commercial off the shelf, inexpensive radar can do for the system. So they need to know what the art of the possible is. But our path to market is always through the integrator. The integrator sort of controls and works with the end user to make sure that the end user gets the right system. We're going to be a component within the system. We're going to be a very important component within the system, but we need to play well within that ecosystem that the integrator and the end user identify to secure that particular location. A lot of that's going to come down to site, what the particulars are of that site and how we think about it, of the system, the integration levels, what the software can handle. So there are many, many ways that, we need to work with the integrator and work well with the integrator.
So let's kind of stick on that kind of deployment best practices theme. What advice would you give to security teams or integrators looking to incorporate drone detection, into their current perimeter or critical asset protection strategies?
Yeah, I would say first thing is good on you. Now is the time to get busy. Second thing is work with your vendors. Just bring a bunch in, talk with them. I don't want to get into sort of wasting a bunch of the integrators' time, but you really need to get a good feel for what's out there before you go to that next step. I would also turn to your policing partners, if you have any contacts at the federal level as well, because there are authorities that have been granted to certain federal agencies that are developing very significant counter-drone experience with both systems and software, and those would be very good resources for critical infrastructure, both end users and integrators to turn to learn more about how things can work. Importantly, number 3, I would say test. Make sure you see how these things work in person. Make sure that these are not can tests to make whatever sensor look good. Make sure you put it through its paces and make sure that you're not the only one there. You want to have other sensors, other systems around it at the same time, because it's not just how the radar behaves, it's how the radar behaves amongst the system it's going to be in. And then lastly, I would say talk to your peers. The security industry is interesting in many ways in that we can share what goes on behind the curtain because there's really nothing competitive between security organizations. We all want to remain safe. And so how we learn from each other and how we feed off each other becomes important. And so there's a lot of expertise being developed out there. For example, Texas Department of Public Safety. they're doing a whole bunch of work across the agencies in Texas. And so if you're an integrator business in Texas, I would certainly say to turn to some of your state agencies in Texas, because you're going to find a lot of experience there. I think you'd find that all the state agencies as well, but I would say that's where you'd want to go for that support as well. And I think that's how I'd approach it. It's learn teach yourself what you can, lean on others, test it and see how it works for yourself. So you develop some firsthand experience, and then turn to your federal partners, because they're doing a lot more work that will be of benefit to everybody.
So obviously each deployment has its own challenges and nuances, but can you generally just touch on some things that challenge that you see integrators and security teams as well challenged by the installation of these systems?
Sure. I was during one of the advanced rulemaking committees for the FAA. We were thinking about working on detection and mitigation, and I co-chaired the technology and systems working group within that. One of my partners was from one of the top 5 airports in the United States. And so I would turn to him and say, hey, when you think about airports, you do these sorts of things. And he looked at me again. He says, look, when you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport, meaning that, every airport's going to be different and your deployments are going to be really unique. And so the rule of thumb is do a very good site survey for everywhere you're going to go, because every location is going to be different. There'll be contours of the land that change some of your thinking. There'll be other things in the area that might impact your thinking. And so by all means, think of every location as unique and work with your vendors to make sure they're unique. The second thing is, though, get out there and do some testing, like real world testing. Hey, we're going to put some things up on a tower. It's going to run there for a month. We have to be able to operate it. Come show us what you can do. And then, work with some local flying clubs, because there's always going to be flying clubs around that want to be able to fly drones, and, come against it so you can see how the system reacts. It is challenging, because these are all activities that are going to be new and they're going to be novel, but sort of the path forward requires this.
Yeah. So are there particular deployment models or use cases where radar-based detection offers the most immediate value?
Well, if your risk model or your threat assessment is such that, anything that crosses the fence line, I have to consider risk. So that would be sort of like your correctional industry. And as soon as it crosses that fence line, I don't know what's going to drop. So I have to consider it a high risk. So, it's sort of those sort of situations where you realize that the data is what's really important. I want to talk about my sensor all day long, how radar is really important. Optical people want to do the same thing. What matters most is the data that comes out the back end of that, how it fits within the data models and how it represents itself on the security screen, so that, experienced personnel know how to react and deal with each situation. And so, there's a bit of training involved there, but overall, it really comes back to how do we work with the integrators? How do we work with the end users, so that when we think about a site, we're thinking about not just what the cost of the equipment is, but how are we doing it? Where's it going to go? How long is it going to be there? How much servicing does it need? We're to come back to it. We're no servicing required, but not every sensor is like that. Some sensors may need service intervals on a regular basis. And so, can I get to the sensor on a regular basis in order to do any servicing required? A lot of things have to go into thinking through where everything goes. We've gone into some initial engagements where people who didn't really think through aerospace security, didn't have that experience so much, would do us, here's our plan for putting it out. And then you have to work through like, well, no, we can't really do that because of X, Y, and Z. And so again, engage your vendors. There's going to be some domain expertise there that will help you think about those site surveys, think about how to do that site deployment, and think about how to do the integration of systems, so that, you don't want to have multiple screens. You're going to have your counter drone information flow into the VMS. The VMS is sort of like your log files. And so everything's got to flow into there so that the VMS maintains track, and you keep your same sort of data model for everything that you're interested in.
So Leo, kind of to wrap up from an industry outlook perspective, as drone technology continues to evolve, how do you see counter-UAS strategies and capabilities, advancing over the next few years?
Well, Rodney, I'd say we have two paths in front of us. And unfortunately, like the great Yogi Berra said, we can't just we can't just take the fork in front of us. And so, between the two paths, we've got one that says we're going to develop this in a way that has no external urgency to it. And that, in other words, nothing bad's going to happen. We're going to do this in a logical fashion and just get our work done. And I think we're on that path. I think we need to double time it. I think there's some urgency that we should keep here in order to be able to equip and develop that. And I think within 5-7 years, you'd have a plan in place that was similar to how the original terrorism acts were related simply sort of after 9/11, and how that funding worked from a federal and non-federal model, and what equipment was deployed and how things were tested. I think we're on that path. And I think the current administration is really putting some energy behind this. And so we're very encouraged that we're going to see real progress here in terms of distributing authorities past where they are today, the very limited authorities that we have today. The second path is where something bad happens. Somebody uses a drone for something terrible, and something terrible happens. It doesn't have to be terrorism, just be something bad luck. Someone flies a drone into a plane. When I think through what that is all going to mean, it's challenging because there's an entire industry that sees a lot of benefit from putting things in the air, like the drone industry, the advanced air mobility industry. They're thinking about all sorts of business models as to how putting things in the air helps society. Drone as a first responder is a great example for that. Drones can be rapidly on scene, get eyeballs on there so that when the public safety folks roll up to that environment, they have information about it, right? I mean, they have some clarity of the scene before they get out of their car. I think if on the path of something bad happens, the challenge is going to be that we all think in sort of 9/11 framework, and that was a terrible tragedy, unspeakable tragedy that put a multi-billion-dollar mature industry on the ground for well over a week, wrecked it for a few. If something bad happens with drones, my fear is they're going to put all the drones on the ground for a couple of years, and who cares? I mean, we don't have the benefits from it yet, and so it's not just that it'll set us back. I think it will sort of delay the industry and all the benefits that we might accrue from having drones in the air. And so I really want that first path. I really want to get down that first path, and I think we're on that path today. I fear for the second path.
I appreciate the perspective. Leo, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your insights on the evolving counter-drone landscape. That wraps up this segment, and now I'll pass it back to my colleague, Sam.
Thank you, Rodney, and thank you, Leo, for this timely conversation on the state of drone security and defending our critical infrastructure. And thank you for tuning in. This podcast is your go-to for staying ahead in the security industry. It offers sharp insights, real-time trends, and straight talk for industry professionals. It's built to keep you informed and empowered wherever you are. Stay connected, stay sharp, and maintain security at the forefront. To access our podcast lineup, go to podbean.com and search for SecurityDNA. You can also find our podcast on our Security Frontline, Integrator Newswire, and Security Week e-newsletters. Of course, we'd love to receive feedback from you, our listeners, about topics that interest you. Reach out to us at Steve, that's STEVE, at SecurityInfoWatch.com with your suggestion. This episode of the SecurityDNA podcast was recorded and produced by Samantha Schober, that's me, Assistant Editor for Security InfoWatch, an Endeavor B2B brand. For Rodney, Leo, and everyone at Security InfoWatch, thanks for listening, and keep an ear open for our next podcast.